that large numbers of young people, and not just young people, were not going to vote for him because of what's going on in Gaza. There were sharp criticisms of Israel and the United States because the U.S. was enabling it. When October 7th happened, overwhelmingly, world opinion was on the side of Israel. Everybody condemned Hamas. Everybody condemned the events of October 7th. And everybody sympathized with Israel. There was no exception to that. But now we're 7 months later. Everybody supports the Palestinians. Everybody condemns Israel. Nobody feels any sympathy anymore for Israel. And my position was, and it remains, that clearly crimes of a significant magnitude happened on October 7th. However, I was unwilling to condemn the perpetrators of those crimes because I had too much knowledge of what the people of Gaza had endured for decades before those crimes were committed. I will not dispute that they were crimes. I will not dispute that they were crimes of a significant magnitude, but I will not condemn the perpetrators of the crimes. So if I were to make an analogy, I would say, let us say that you are the next door neighbor of a woman who has been battered and battered and battered by her husband. She screams and yells, and all the neighbors hear the screams and yells, but they don't do anything. She calls the police, and the police say, this is a domestic dispute. That means it's a dispute between the husband and the wife, and we're not going to get involved. One day, you, the neighbor, are returning home, and suddenly you see the house where that woman and her husband live. It's surrounded by police and by journalists. And you hear that the woman stabbed her husband 100 times with a kitchen knife. And then, because you're the next door neighbor, some journalists come to your home, knock on your door, and then they say, did you hear what happened? She stabbed her husband 100 times. She must have been a monster. She must have been a horrible, horrible, horrible human being. And that poor man, how he suffered. And then you see the headlines on the morning newspaper next morning. Monster woman stabs husband 100 times. Well, I'm sure you acknowledge stabbing somebody 100 times is a horrible thing. But you were there for 20 years. You heard the screams. You heard the yells. She tried to contact the police, and the police wouldn't interfere. They say it's a domestic dispute. So I ask you a simple question. She killed him. She stabbed him 100 times. She killed him. Honestly, I'm not asking you to agree with me. Would you condemn the woman? And nobody listened. She tried everything, and nobody would pay attention. So that was my dilemma on October 7th. I knew the details. I studied them very closely. I could not condemn them. And that meant I was not going to be in any television program, radio program, in any newspaper. I would say I have written the only political history of Gaza. Of the, how many people are on the planet? 7 billion, is it? Yeah, of the 7 billion people on the planet, I have written the only political history of Gaza. And you know, in the mainstream media, even today, after 7 months, if you were to do a Google search, go to New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, you take the entire spectrum of the mainstream media, you will see there has never been one mention of the book or one mention of me. Even though, as you know, I have a very high presence now on the social media. It is the only political history of Gaza, and not one mention at all. I consider that one of my greatest achievements. It's so funny. So in the United States, after October 7th, the limit was anybody who gets public recognition has to condemn what Hamas did on October 7th. That was the limit. If you didn't condemn, then you will not be recognized in the mainstream media. The International Court of Justice, which has many Western powers represented on its court, they would overwhelmingly, including the American judge at the time, Joan Donahue, would overwhelmingly say that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. That nobody could predict. I would never have predicted that. I didn't. I thought the court would never do that. Students who have enormous challenges ahead of them. There is a weak economy. There is student debt. There is climate change. They have many political challenges. Who would have predicted that of all the political challenges confronting them, they would invest their energies and really make real sacrifices for the sake of a poor, powerless, and stateless people halfway around the world, namely the people of Gaza. And it was not predicted by me, for sure. Whether what Hamas did on October 7th was a wise thing or a stupid thing, whether it was a necessary step towards ending the horror in Gaza or whether it was a totally criminal act, I have been reluctant to pass judgment. I kind of think it should be up to the people of Gaza to decide whether what happened, not just on October 7th, but for the past 7 months, we still may be closer to the beginning than to the end of the conflict. It's for them to decide whether it was worth it. Gaza has been turned into a parking lot. Israel has destroyed everything. It is so pulverized, so reduced to dust that a large number of people not only don't have a home to go back to, but they have no idea where their home was. If you imagine your neighborhood where you live, where it's all reduced to rubble, let's say an atomic bomb were dropped in your neighborhood, and it's all rubble. It's just pebbles, stones, dust. Could you find your block where you lived in that rubble? That's Gaza. And it's going to be for the people themselves to decide whether it was worth it. I don't want to pass a judgment on that. There's no question in my mind that the student movement played a critical role in forcing President Biden to adjust his policies, which up until the emergence of the student movement were enabling the Israeli genocide with no restrictions whatsoever. The student movement posed a very big problem for President Biden for a very simple reason. It catapulted the anti-genocide movement to a new level of public awareness. Obviously, there was public awareness about Gaza before the student movement, but the student movement raised it to a new level, the public awareness. And the second thing was students represent votes. And this is a presidential year. And Biden was being informed by his pollsters, the people who predict voter turnout and predict who will win, that these student demonstrations were doing real damage to the base of the Democratic Party. That large numbers of young people, and not just young people, were not going to vote for him because of what's going on in Gaza. And it was the student movement which, let's just say, it brought the issue to critical mass. Obviously, there was a lot of concern before, but the student movement raised it to a new level and forced Biden to reconsider his policies. I personally thought that he would make the adjustment, Biden, at New Year's time, because I felt he thought he needed at least a year to get on board with the anti-genocide movement. What happened was he and his campaign managers decided they needed half a year, that by June, with the election 5 months off, we really have to end this Gaza thing because it's causing us too much damage. They didn't believe that in January. In January, they thought they could still go on. People, and the war will end maybe in June, and people will forget because people do forget. It's true. And then the argument about Biden being a lesser evil to Trump would set in. Obviously, there was a lot of awareness before the student movement. Obviously, there are many factors involved. Biden's decision. There is the International Court of Justice. There is the International Criminal Court. There is European allies. There's the Security Council. All over, there were sharp criticisms of Israel and the United States because the U.S. was enabling it. But I think the factor that put it over the top or caused critical mass was the student movement. And now, I would say, just as a side note, I always listen closely to the Chinese representative. Frankly, I think at this point, everyone recognizes what the Chinese say is probably the most significant statements now coming out of the Security Council, because the others are predictable, whereas the Chinese, you're looking for every choice of words to see exactly where they stand. But their position has, both in my opinion, the Ukraine and also in Gaza, their position has been very reasonable, in my view. In any event, the student movement will inevitably die out during the summer because schools are out, campuses are empty, and it's too soon to say what things will look like.